confirm now that the session is recording, so we will get underway. It's been a really popular session, as I mentioned a few moments ago. We've had over 300 people sign up for this particular webinar, so it's obviously a hot topic. Hopefully Rachel and I have got some really useful information that we can impart today that you can take back to your apprentices to and help them prepare and help them to recognize that although delivering a presentation might seem like a daunting prospect, it really doesn't have to be. And there's some fairly basic principles actually that, if applied, will massively help apprentices to mentally prepare, to prepare some good content, and also to have a good experience and hopefully a good outcome as well. So I have a slide deck. I'm not going to bore you to death with PowerPoint, but we do have some bullet points on each one, just as a bit of a visual aid for myself more than anything. And we've got an hour and a half in the diary, so I expect it'll take about an hour really for Rachel and I to get through the content, and that's allowing for any questions that you might have throughout. We'll pause kind of at different stages throughout the presentation to answer any of the questions that are in the chat box. And hopefully I think we should have about half an hour left at the end as well for a bit of an open question and answer session as well. So if you do have any questions around kind of specific cohort or individual apprentices, please do kind of pick those up with us afterwards. But if you have any general questions that you think are relevant to the group, please do ask them. I think it'll be a much more valuable, a much more interesting session if you do ask questions, and I know you guys always do, so please feel free to do that. We have muted everybody and turned everybody's cameras off simply because we have so many people signed up and didn't want it to get kind of too chaotic. So please do use that chat function to post your questions. While I'm presenting, I might not be able to see them. So for that reason, what I'll do is I'll pause kind of at different stages throughout and ask Chelsea to read them out. And between Rachel and I, hopefully we can answer any and all of them. And if not, I'm sure we can take them away and get you a pretty speedy answer following the session. So the session's focused on presentations as an endpoint assessment method. So we're going to start with a bit of an overview about DSW for those of you who are new to us or who haven't started working with us yet. And I'll introduce myself, a bit about my background, and then also my colleague Rachel. Then we're going to dive straight in actually to the common pitfalls, which might seem like starting on a bit of a negative, but actually we wanted to get that out of the way so then the rest of the session can focus on the positives. But also I think it's in many ways it's more useful to know what the common pitfalls are, so you can give apprentices kind of that heads up, and they're all very easily avoidable actually if you just follow the principles that we're going to discuss throughout. Then we move on to what makes a strong presentation. So obviously avoiding those pitfalls, but also what are the other tips that we've got that we can share with you. As an endpoint assessment organization, we've carried out hundreds, if not thousands of assessments with presentations in them. So between Rachel and I, we have a lot of insights actually, and a lot of experience, and we've reached out to our assessors ahead of this session as well to ask for any specific feedback that they've got, any content they'd like us to add in. So it's all really relevant, it's all really up to date, and hopefully there'll be some key takeaways that everyone can take away from the session today. The rules and the purpose of the presentation differs from standard to standard, and that's kind of dictated by the assessment plan. But most of what Rachel and I will talk about today is generic guidance, the generic principles that apply to any presentation in any EPA. However, to demonstrate that there are some differences, Rachel's going to talk you through 3 different standards to just kind of show what that looks like. And then, as I say, hopefully at the end, we've got plenty of time for a question and answer session as well. So as an organization, we've been around since the 1990s. We were set up and originally offered kind of learning and development solutions to employers, primarily in the financial services and banking industries. So a lot of it was providing them with personnel and expertise and talent to help them to grow their businesses and solve particular challenges. But we also deliver lots of kind of training programs into those employers as well. When the apprenticeship reforms happened and the levy came about, obviously that created a bit of a sea change in terms of the mindset and the buying behaviours, I guess, of employers when it comes to their L&D. So yeah, so when the apprenticeship reforms happened, we found ourselves in the fortunate position, I guess, of employers coming to us actually, not kind of having to seek them out. So we started delivering apprenticeship endpoint assessment to lots of banks, building societies, investment and insurance firms very successfully. And then we started to grow our portfolio of standards and grow the number and the range of different types of training providers and employers that we supported. So now we kind of deliver all of the financial services apprenticeships, but we also deliver a lot of the pan-sector stuff, so business administration, leadership and management, and we work now in areas such as HR and housing as well. So it's been a really enjoyable experience, actually. It continues to grow, and having that exposure to different industries and, you know, different types of provider and types of employer with different needs has been really, really insightful. So at the moment, we're working with 150 training providers, delivering endpoint assessment to over 3,000 employers, and that's across all sectors of the economy and different industries. So a little bit about myself. So I've been involved in apprenticeships since 2006. I worked originally for a couple of the biggest awarding bodies in the UK, a range of different roles from quality assurance through to product development. I'm also a qualified assessor and IQA. And in terms of DSW, I oversee the endpoint assessment side of the business. And the most enjoyable part of that actually is working with providers and employers and apprentices and having the opportunity to deliver sessions and webinars like this one. It's really rewarding, and particularly so when you have lots of questions, which hopefully you will. So enough about me. I'm going to hand over to Rachel for her to introduce herself.
Thank you. I think everyone can hear me, except Jake, actually. But anyway, so I'm Rachel Wrathmell. I'm a qualified high-level assessor for DSW, and I've been here working with them for the last few years. I have got 20 years of experience, gained across various leadership, compliance roles, and latterly training and competence within financial services. And over the last few years, while I have been assessing at DSW, my focus as standards has been on standards that all incorporate presentation elements. So hopefully today I'm well positioned to provide you with some useful insights on how you can support your learners.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so we're going to move on to the content of the webinar now. And we'll start with an overview around presentations as an EPA method. So from what I've seen, I think presentations are becoming an increasingly popular method of assessment within apprenticeships. So currently sitting on a number of different trailblazer groups. And when they get to the point where they've written the KSBs, they've written the pass and distinction descriptors, and they're getting on to developing their endpoint assessment, and they're exploring the different assessment methods that are available, presentations seem to be really, really popular, and we're starting to see more and more of them in the different standards. So within DSW's portfolio of standards, we have 10 that include presentations as an assessment method. And as I said, the rules differ slightly depending on the assessment plan. So I would urge you to read the toolkit, read the assessment plan before you start delivering, so you can understand what the purpose of the presentation is, but then also what the rules are. So by rules, I mean things like how long should the presentation last? Is there a Q&A session? How many questions is the assessor permitted to ask in that Q&A session? Because those parameters are really, really important in designing and delivering that particular presentation. So I've mentioned a couple of times the purpose and the requirements. So the purpose really is the core part. And we do see quite frequently actually apprentices who might deliver a really good presentation, and they've clearly put a lot of work into preparing it. It's a very sleek delivery. They don't have any technical issues like I have, but they deliver a really good presentation, and actually they've missed the core purpose. And they're talking about things that are really good and really interesting and compelling, but that's not what they're supposed to be talking about. And you'd be really surprised at how often that happens. So I cannot kind of iterate enough. Focus on that purpose as the starting point when you're supporting apprentices to deliver that presentation. And we are going to revisit that notion of purpose kind of frequently throughout this session. And so I said before, largely what Rachel and I plan to talk about today are some of the common principles really which apply to any standard. One of the common myths, I guess, which we want to expel around presentations is, and one of the reasons I think that apprentices get nervous is they think that we're assessing their levels of confidence, and they think that we're assessing
how sleek their presentation is, and quite often we're not. In fact, usually when we're not, what we're assessing is whether or not that apprentice has met the learning outcomes that are mapped to that assessment method. And Rachel and I took part in a standardization session a few weeks back with a number of our assessors and IQAs, and we watched some recordings, and there was an apprentice who delivered a presentation, and he more or less read verbatim a script that he had on his slides. But we all unanimously agreed that that apprentice, although it wasn't kind of the most compelling mode of delivery, that apprentice did actually pass, and warranted that pass because he met those learning outcomes. So I think that's a really useful piece of intelligence to feed back to the apprentices. Is they might not be the most confident person, they might not be the most natural speaker in the world, but that is not a barrier to them having a good experience and coming away with a good outcome from that assessment. If they feel, I need that anchor of all of the content on the slides and I'm just going to read the content out, that is actually okay. We're not going to penalize them for that. It's a really important point to remember. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who I can now hear, who's going to talk through some of those common pitfalls that we mentioned at the start.
Thank you. And yes, here we are with the technology. We did practice it many times. Make sure that we didn't fall into the common pitfalls, but hey ho, it just goes to show. And what I would like to reassure all of you is when learners do have technical difficulties, which we all suffer every now and again, we do take care of them, and we're very reassuring in that situation. It just allows us a bit of an opportunity to share that with you. So some of the common pitfalls that we pulled out, and Jake has alluded to this, we've sourced some of this information from a range of assessors across DSW. So here we go. So one of the first things that we see is that learners are spending a lot of time introducing themselves, their background, where they've worked, what their career aspirations are. It's all very nice to hear, but it can take away from the presentation. I've had a learner who spent 5 minutes doing that introduction about themselves in a 20-minute presentation. So it just goes to show where that can take away, and it moves nicely into that second pitfall of poor time management. So we've got that spread of information about themselves, but the time management, not enough information or too much. So we've got a couple of recent examples here where we've got 20 to 30 minutes for a presentation. Learn out some, they were brilliant designed slides, but they were done in 12 minutes and they did not hit 50% of the learning outcomes. And in contrast, then we had another learner who had 30 slides for a 20-minute presentation and didn't get through them all. So we have learners coming in at both ends of that particular spectrum. We've got apprentices coming in who aren't familiar with the platform. So we operate on 3 platforms. Some of it's about availability, but we do offer to switch should that be necessary for an apprentice. And them not being familiar with Zoom or WebEx or Teams and coming in and not knowing how to share screens or how to operate it, it just adds to their pressure as they come through. And we're picking on some general things here, because the first thing that we do with apprenticeships when they come through for their presentation assessment, it's usually connected with another. We will always start with a presentation. So if they have this moment where we are coming in and they're not familiar with it, then it's the presentation that gets the worst hit of that, because they're nervous about that anyway. The other common pitfall is this focus on knowledge and hypothetical. This is what I would do. And obviously, if they're doing this apprenticeship alongside some of the other qualifications, which are very heavily knowledge, then that might be where that one comes from. It's really important that for any knowledge and outcomes that they're able to demonstrate it through actual application of the skill and the behaviour. We are going to cover that obviously a bit later on. And the presentation not designed to hit all the learning outcomes, which puts a lot of pressure on the question and answer section of a presentation, which its purpose is to validate and take that to a greater depth. And then the final one we put on this particular slide is covering learning outcomes that are assessed by other methods. So commonly, we've got the operation department manager, and we're going to come on to these in a bit more detail. That one would cover a project skill, whereas for team leader, not so. That is covered within the professional discussion. So really important to pull apart where those learning outcomes are being assessed to make sure they have maximised the opportunity to pass the ones that are being assessed by the presentation. So I started to allude to this top one before. It's a reflective piece rather than evidence of skills used. It's really important. It is about how they've applied the knowledge and skill. Some learners come on and have a story to tell and a reflection of what they've done, but aren't really, or what they might do, but they're not really evidencing what they have done. We've included here, and it will get covered again as we go through, apprentices not in the assessment mindset, and we see this in a few different ways. So for example, you know, how they turn up. Now, we don't have a dress code, as many organisations don't have dress codes, and it is an assessment. And I think we think that apprentices have fallen into the trap of forgetting that they're in an assessment because they're at home or whatever. And we've seen learners turn up to their assessment on a hot day without a top, or in hoodies, or in pyjamas, and they're doing these presentations for a professional qualification. And we're covering here again this lack of confidence. So I think I've said that already, so I won't go over that again. And then not prepared and unnecessary nerves. So they've written the presentation, they might not have practiced it, they've certainly not practiced it on the platform that they're on. And they're bringing in then those unnecessary nerves to what is already a nerve-wracking situation for these learners. And I would say, you know, we're very, very, we're not there to trip anybody up as assessors. I think we're very good at helping those apprentices relax and get ready when they come in, but so much can be done to help them before they come in by making sure they are prepared. And then we put on their apprentice not in an appropriate environment, and we think that this is really important post-COVID, because obviously in the COVID times there wasn't a choice. You know, there were where they could find a quiet space in the house, and you know, we've got apprentices that are coming on to calls, and then they don't realise that they've got to spin their laptops, cameras around the room, and they're making apologies before they even begin because they've got piles of washing, or washing on the radiators, and piles of things that they don't really want us to see. As that, you know, they're not proud moments as they come in to showcase their experience over the last couple of years. So you know, obviously they don't lose marks for that, and it does take away from them, in my experience, in terms of their confidence when they've to make those apologies from the start.
Thank you, Rachel. I think one of the points you made on the previous slide is a really important one. And ahead of this session, when I reached out to our assessors and IQAs and said, look, what do you see as the common pitfalls? What tips do you have for apprentices? That one came, I think, from every single assessor, that idea of covering off content in their presentation that isn't assessed by that method, and particularly with the newer assessment plans. So anything that was published, say, in the last 18 to 24 months, they are very clear now as for this assessment method, these are the KSBs that are being assessed. For this assessment method, these are the KSBs. So actually, we find apprentices who are delivering really good content as part of the presentation, but they're not getting any marks for it because that's assessed elsewhere. And as an assessment organisation, even if we see it, we can't apply it holistically because they're two different methods. So it's really important that when the apprentice is putting together and when they're running their mock presentations with their coach or whoever it is, that you're checking that they're covering the content they need to, and they're not covering content that they should be covering elsewhere. It's a really important point. Sorry,
I've just noticed a question coming up, and it's a really good one actually. So and it's relevant right now. Is can they use a background on the presentation? And learners commonly come in and think they put a black blur in the background, and they use these fancy backgrounds in their general day-to-day working at home, and they can under the rules of our virtual assessment, they have to switch off those backgrounds, and that to some learners is a bit of a horror, because they switch off the background and then realise they've got the true background, which they're a bit of ashamed to share in some cases. So I did think it was worth just calling it out there.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rachel. I have seen that when I've kind of been involved in IQA and on assessments, and the learner has the blurred background. But obviously, if the assessor has to check that they're in an appropriate environment, there's not somebody there kind of aiding them in any way inappropriately, they can't do that if the background's blurred. So I can see why learners do it. I blurred my background, but actually in an assessment, you're not permitted to do it. I'm just going to pause and just check if there are any other questions in there. So there's one, is there a common presentation title? So that's one that differs from standard to standard. And we take our steer from whatever's written in the published assessment plan. So some assessment plans, for example, might say the apprentice will be given a title from the following bank. Quite often they'll say endpoint assessment organisations may add to that bank over time. So there's not kind of one answer to that. I think it depends on the individual toolkit. But if you do find that you're delivering a standard and for whatever reason it's not clear in the toolkit or you're still unsure, do come back to us and we'll be able to let you know. Another question here, a common question I get asked is, do they have to use slides for the presentation, or can they refer to their project write-up or alternative presentation method? So I think we half answered that one in that if the assessment plan says that certain outcomes have to be met in the presentation, they have to be met in the presentation. So you can't just say, oh, well, as you've seen in my project or as you've seen them, because quite often, as Rachel said, they're doing the presentation first. And so they might be referring to stuff that perhaps the assessor hasn't even seen. So it's a much safer bet to make sure that the slides or whatever format the apprentice is using contains all of the content for all of the learning outcomes. And if they do that, quite often by the time they get to that Q&A, they've already passed that method anyway, because all of the content's in there, and the Q&A becomes just a bit more of a deep dive exercise and actually can focus a lot more on the distinction descriptors, for example.
You just mentioned something there, Jake, which I think is quite relevant in that I think learners sometimes think because they've presented it to us, or they've covered it in the portfolio, or they've covered it in the professional discussion, that we've seen it, and all these assessments usually sit completely independent of each other, and we do remind them of that. But when they're doing the introductions, I think they think they're doing the introduction for the whole of the apprenticeship, which isn't the purpose of that introduction at the beginning of a presentation. Yeah,
exactly that. I mean, it's a bit of a kind of lazy comparison, I guess, but if you were doing two maths exams and one was kind of algebra, and the other wasn't, the examiner couldn't say, oh, well, I saw that you answered that question in a different paper. You have to kind of mark that assessment on its own merit. So it's much safer and more reliable to just cover everything in the presentation that you need to. They don't have to use slides. They don't have to use PowerPoint. And it's a point I was going to make later on, but I'll make it now. We often get asked kind of, does it have to be PowerPoint? I know that Rachel's never assessed a presentation where the apprentice hasn't used PowerPoint. Again, it's usually determined by the assessment plan, but usually the assessment plan will say they use whatever format they feel most comfortable with. I think apprentices tend to use PowerPoint because it's so ubiquitous and it's so easy to use. I'm using it for this presentation now, but that's not to say that they have to. Actually, if they're really good with an alternative method or an alternative platform, then usually they're free to use that.
And I think, Claire, you're asking about team leader learner who doesn't want to use a PowerPoint presentation. We need those materials 2 weeks before. So, part of the challenge is how they get those materials for that particular standard, where they're not necessarily using PowerPoint. So,
yeah. But I think it's a really valid question, and actually as an endpoint assessment organisation, we absolutely should not be dictating you have to use PowerPoint if it doesn't say that in the assessment plan. So we would always kind of give that flexibility to the apprentice, but actually if they're not using it, do give us a heads up, and then we can have a conversation about what might be the best way to share that information in advance, so that the assessor gets the info that they need. A question there from Peter. So how many slides would you recommend, please? I think it's difficult to say because it depends on whether it's just bullet points or if there's a lot more content on there. I think that the only way really to establish what's appropriate is through the practicing of it. So it depends on the pace of the delivery from the person that's speaking. But really, I think generally I would say no more than one slide per minute. Otherwise, I think the apprentice is going to find themselves rushing through a lot of the content. And it's when the apprentice rushes is usually when they start to panic, or it's usually when they fail. And it's because we all do it. Nobody particularly likes doing things like presentations or interviews or anything like that. But when you're nervous, and particularly if you've only got bullet points ahead of you, you rush through and you miss a lot of the key information. And although there might be a question and answer session that follows the presentation, usually the assessors are limited in how many questions they can ask in that session. And that's usually dictated in the assessment plan as well. So the apprentice can't kind of put very limited information in the presentation or rush through the presentation and think, oh, well, it'll get picked up in the Q&A, because it probably can't. Q&A really should be there just to kind of address any of the gaps, do a bit of a deeper dive where it's appropriate, but it's not there kind of as an option to cover off large amounts of the learning outcomes and content. We've got lots of questions, so before I move on, we're
going to cover, aren't we, as we go through? So.
I think we probably are, yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'll crack on with the next bit, because I don't want to kind of talk at length about managing your time in a presentation that failed to manage my own. So I'll move on to the next section, and then at the end, like I say, we should have about half an hour spare, so we can go through that chat box and answer any of the ones that we haven't answered as we've gone through. But do please keep them coming. These are really good questions, and like I say, it makes it a lot more interesting than just kind of listening to somebody talk for an hour. Okay. So what makes a strong presentation? So first of all, avoid the pitfalls. It's fairly obvious, but we didn't want to kind of just leave you with that. So we've developed some further content. And again, a lot of it, to be honest, it really just sounds like common sense, but these are the things that we see again and again and again that apprentices either do or don't do, which are very easily avoidable by kind of being in the right mindset, doing the preparation, thinking of it as kind of a serious assessment, albeit one in which the assessor is going to try and calm you and put you at ease. But actually it's a work-based professional assessment. And so if you just follow these principles generally, I think you can't go wrong. So it sounds obvious, a clear structure, and this can come down to nerves as well. I think the apprentice might have a structure in their mind, they panic on the day, so practice makes perfect, but it doesn't have to be sophisticated or complicated. It's as easy as an introduction, deliver the content that's mapped to those KSBs, and then just summarize at the end, and that summary leads very nicely into the Q&A session. And it's really important in the introduction, like Rachel said, is that the introduction is not necessarily for the apprentice to give a background about themselves. It is genuinely nice to hear it and to hear where they worked and what their career aspirations are, but quite often that's not what's being assessed. And so they're using up valuable time to talk about stuff that isn't going to actually contribute towards their grade at the end. Really what the introduction should focus on is almost kind of, okay, the purpose of my presentation is this. I'm going to talk to you about this, and it might be I'm going to talk to you about this project that I was involved in. It was a really high-profile project in the business. I had to work with multiple stakeholders. Lots of problems came up along the way, and I had to use problem-solving techniques to get over those. I'm going to talk to you about those techniques and then summarize it at the end. That's the kind of structure that we're looking for. And in terms of kind of approaching the development of the presentation and the content for the presentation, we don't kind of mandate a particular process. It is up to the apprentice and whatever they feel comfortable with, but we do have a suggested approach. And the reason we have the suggested approach is one of the questions we do get asked quite frequently is, can the apprentice simply list the learning outcomes in the presentation and then talk about each one? And the answer to that is yes, they can, unless there's something in the assessment plan that says that they can't. But actually, it's probably not the best approach. I can understand why it might feel compelling to do that, because it almost feels fail-safe. Well, if I list the outcome and then talk about what I did, I can't fail. But what it usually results in is a bit of a clunky, a bit of an artificial presentation, which is not really that engaging for the apprentice or for the assessor. I think what's better is to focus on that purpose first. So have a look at the toolkit. What's the purpose of the presentation? Okay, well, the purpose is I'm supposed to be talking about a project that I was involved in. That's a really good starting point for the apprentice, because then they can start. It's almost like when they do a portfolio and they start with that reflective statement. you look at the blank piece of paper at the start and it feels like this is really overwhelming. But if you just start to reflect on something that you did and write about something that you did, you start to find all of those bits fall together. The passion of the apprentice comes across, their character and personality comes across. So focusing on that purpose really and that activity is the best starting point, and then design that into content. It might be a slide deck, it might be something different, and then look at the learning outcomes and identify any gaps. And what you'll probably find is the apprentice will think, right, okay, I've covered 80% of it, 90% of it anyway in what I've talked about. There's a couple of gaps in there because there's a bit around stakeholder management which I haven't covered, so I'm going to write that into it. So we think it's much better to do it that way than the other way around. So don't look at the learning outcomes and try and pin evidence on the learning outcomes. Look at the activity and then map that to the outcomes and fill the gaps. And then the next bit sounds obvious, but again, it's evident that it doesn't always happen, is giving the apprentice the opportunity to practice that. So that will get them familiar with the learning outcomes. It will help them to be familiar with the technology. It'll help them to become familiar with what might be a fairly alien notion to them of presenting information to a stranger who's a fellow professional. So what sometimes is useful is delivering it not only to the apprentice's coach, but maybe to another coach who they're not as familiar with. It's worth recording the session as well, so the apprentice has the opportunity to watch it back. And then they'll notice things in their behavior and in their delivery that they weren't aware of. And any one of us could watch back a recording of ourselves speaking and be surprised at what we saw. It's not always the most comfortable thing to watch, but it's a really, really useful activity. So I would very much encourage apprentices to do that. And then getting the feedback from the coach, who ideally should be marking it as well against those learning outcomes. The combination of their own self-reflection and the feedback that they get from the coach of, okay, actually, I laboured this point for too long. I missed off loads of content because I was nervous. Actually, I can update my slides a little bit here. And then refining that and repeating that process, they will be far more confident going into that assessment. They'll have a much better experience, and the likelihood is they'll have a much better outcome as well. So it's not a mandated approach, but from our experience, it's probably the best approach. Start with a purpose first, design the content, map it to the outcomes and fill the gaps, and then just that feedback cycle of getting feedback, practicing getting feedback until they're really confident with what they're talking about. They've got good examples that just, they can spit out really confidently, and they're not nervous about it because they know the stuff and they know what they're talking about. Okay, so a couple more slides on what makes a strong presentation. So confidence with the platform's functionality. I feel slightly hypocritical given the technical issues they had at the beginning of this session. But it's not just the platform. So I would reiterate what Rachel said, is we are flexible in terms of the platform that the apprentice can use. So when you have that planning meeting with the DSW assessor, if the apprentice, they use Teams every day and they're really confident with it, tell the assessor, and then the assessor will make every effort to make sure that Teams is the platform that's used. We want it to be as comfortable as possible for the apprentice. We want to assess whether or not they're competent at the learning outcomes. We don't want to assess how good they are at using Teams or Zoom or anything like that. It's not necessarily what we're looking for. But not just the platform, but the functionality. So the ability to share the screen without showing the notes, knowing how to unblur the background if the assessor asks them to do that, all of those sorts of things. It's not just about kind of, I can use it. I use Teams every day to chat to my colleagues. Can you use it to kind of present information and that sort of thing? The next one's a really important one. So understanding controlled assessment conditions. Surprising how often apprentices don't seem aware of the fact that they need their ID. They don't seem aware, like Rachel said, that they have to show the environment. It doesn't matter if the apprentice is in a messy room. We're certainly not going to penalise them for it. But like Rachel said, you can sometimes see the embarrassment of, I didn't realise I was going to have to do this. You don't want to start your assessment like that. So making sure that the apprentice knows that they need to be in an appropriate environment. They're going to have to show the assessor the room that they're in. They'll need to bring the photographic ID with them, and they need to be in an environment where they're not going to be disturbed by people coming in and things like that. It is surprising how often apprentices don't seem aware of those things, and it instantly puts them psychologically on the back foot. So mindset, something that we've talked a lot about, and it's really, really important. I think it's I'll be clear, actually, most apprentices, I think, are very, very professional in their assessments and are clearly of the right mindset, but that's not always the case. And when you have the apprentice who turns up and they have no top on because it's a hot day, this is supposed to be a professional assessment. It is almost disrespectful, I think, to the assessor and also to your employer if you're going to kind of treat it in that way. So just making sure that the apprentice, you don't want them to feel daunted at it, but you do want them to understand that this is a professional assessment and actually they should treat it as though they're almost going in for a job interview. So be there a couple of minutes early, make sure that you're dressed appropriately, all of those sorts of things. This is another point that Rachel made, but it's a really important one, so I'm going to make it again. We're looking for real life application of the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours. It's surprising how many apprentices go into that presentation and they talk about what they would do. That's not what we're assessing. We're assessing what you have done. And that is at the core of apprenticeships. That's what every single apprenticeship is about. It's about how they demonstrate the KSBs in their workplace on the job. So hypothetical examples on what we're looking for. We're looking for that real life application. And then the final point on there is about using notes. So if I use PowerPoint as an example, because like I say, it's the one that the apprentices tend to use, there's nothing to stop the apprentice when they send those PowerPoint slides to the assessor 2 weeks ahead of the assessment. There's nothing to stop them sending their notes with that presentation, and actually that can help the assessor and it can help the apprentice because it gives a lot of that background context that you don't get from a bunch of bullet points. So sending the notes in advance is useful. Having the notes there to refer to when you're delivering as the apprentice. It's surprising how many apprentices go in and they don't have any notes and they've got some bullet points, and if they have these problems at the start and they get flustered, you can see that they've got loads of content there that they just miss because they're rushing through it and they're done in 10 minutes. And it's such a shame when they've done 2 years worth of hard work and they prepared for this assessment to fall down at that stage. So submit the notes along with your presentation, make sure that you've got the notes there with you, and just have the confidence to think, I'm going to take a moment here. I feel like I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. I'm just going to refer to my notes. Even tell the assessor that that's what you're going to do. They're not going to penalise you for that at all. If anything, I think as an assessor, I would probably respect that, somebody saying that to me. So use the notes effectively, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to there.
James asked a question, Jake, which
Sure.
we have to say now, which is, are the learners expected to talk all the time? Yes, they are. You know, the presentation time is for the learner to present, and after that, then we move into the questions and answers. There's no interaction. They're not expected to engage with us until we start moving to that question and answers section. So,
yeah, thank you, Rachel. Okay, so this is the last slide for me, actually, and then we'll pause for questions, or we'll ask Rachel to go into some of those 3 standards that we said we'd look at in a bit more detail. So work-based evidence. So actually, this is something that I hadn't considered, but in conversations with Rachel planning for this session, Rachel gave some good examples of where apprentices have done that effectively. So Rachel, do you want to just talk us through that example?
Yes, sure. So some of the things that I think really work, if someone's showing about a project, they might put snippets in. So I think I must make the point here. What doesn't work is if someone's putting a whole massive spreadsheet on a slide, you know, but where they've the learner has picked out snippets from maybe a Gantt chart or from a risk log or from a piece of feedback that they've had in a witness statement. All sorts of things that could be added that just put a bit of colour and validation against what the learner is talking about. I think really work and bring a strength through.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, that validation point's important, actually, because I think apprentices who have done the stuff, they've applied the skills, but then for whatever reason, they get into the presentation and they're focused on the knowledge. If they've got a picture of a Gantt chart on there, that's a really good prompt for the assessor in the Q&A session to say, okay, talk me through that. And then the assessor will satisfy themselves that, yeah, they have done this thing. It's not just something that's theoretical or hypothetical. They have done it. And just visually as well, I think it can really kind of help the presentation to flow. Okay, so the next one is cover all of the required learning outcomes in the presentation, and the key bit there is in the presentation. You're massively disadvantaging yourself as an apprentice if you don't cover all of those mandatory outcomes in the presentation. why wouldn't you? So like I said earlier on, if you can get all of that content across in your slides and in your delivery, you're going into that Q&A session in a very, very comfortable place, and you might already have passed that method by the time you get to the Q&A. Don't rely on the Q&A as a means of covering off the learning outcomes. The Q&A is kind of a fallback for the assessor to say, okay, I didn't quite get this part, so can you just talk me through it? Or I think it might be an opportunity for a distinction here, so dive a little bit deeper into that element of it. So it's massively in the apprentice's interest to be satisfied that they've covered all of those learning outcomes in full in the presentation. Checking for accuracy before submitting sounds ludicrously obvious, but this is particularly important with the newer plans. So the newer assessment plans tend to have very strict timelines in them, which we have to adhere to religiously as an EPAO. So for example, it might say X number of weeks after going through Gateway, the apprentice must submit their presentation materials. They must then deliver their presentation within 2 weeks of submitting those materials. And the reason for those controls really is so that some apprentices don't get an unfair advantage, and someone doesn't spend 6 months developing a presentation when someone else only had 2 weeks. So for that reason, once the apprentice has submitted those presentation materials, they cannot change them, because obviously it would be fundamentally unfair if we give them an extra 2 weeks to kind of get some more feedback and make some amends. Once they've submitted them, they cannot change them. So when it comes to the assessment event, they need to present that same presentation that they sent to the assessor 2 weeks ago, or whatever the time frame is. They can't come along and say, oh, I've made some slight tweaks to it. It's not permitted. They have to deliver that same presentation. So for that reason, it's really important that they are 100% confident of its accuracy before they submit it. And obviously it's then worth the apprentice checking with their skills coach or checking with a line manager or whomever it may be to say, can you just have a quick look at this, sense check it, have I covered everything that I need to? Because once you've sent it, there's no going back. What makes a strong presentation? Effective time management. We've talked about that at the start in terms of the pitfalls. So really, I think the optimum is try to get it bang on time. So if you've got 20 minutes allowed, try and get it exactly on 20 minutes, because then you're maximizing the amount of time that you've got, because 20 minutes isn't a lot of time. When you look at the learning outcomes, quite often there are kind of lots of them, and the outcomes themselves can be quite complex. They can be quite compound in nature. And the only way that the apprentice can be confident that they're going to hit that time is through practicing it. And I practice it. Oh, I've gone 10 minutes over. I'm going to have to strip some content out. I'm going to listen back to my recording. I spent far too long talking about that bit. They have to practice it, and it's not just a case of practicing it once and oh great, I'm ready to go. The chances are they're going to have to practice it multiple times and refine it, watch the recordings, get the feedback. And I do know that sounds kind of very ideological, and it can be difficult to get apprentices. They're busy with work. They're not often as engaged as we would like them to be, but they're going to have a much better experience, and they're going to come away with a better grade if they do invest that time in practicing. It's not going to be as daunting to them. They're not going to get flustered. They're probably actually going to enjoy it. And the last point on there is dress appropriately. So I shan't labour that because we have kind of discussed it at length, but appropriately is the key thing. We're not expecting people to turn up in a 3-piece suit and a top hat, but it's treated as though, for example, it's a job interview, and what do you think is professional and what do you think is respectable under those circumstances? Okay, so I think that was it in terms of what makes a strong presentation. Rachel, would you like to pause for more questions, or would you like to?
Yeah, there's a couple of presentations that I think a couple of questions that have been asked. So Angela was talking about whether an individual, if their presentation's strong and then they're not quite so confident in their questions, can they still pass? The answer to that is yes, they can. Yep. I've very much seen that. I think if a learner has really gone and covered all the outcomes in the pass arena, the questions, in my experience, are used to try and push people into those distinction arenas. So, and if they know the material well enough, the worst case scenario is they answer the question based on the examples they've given in the presentation. Yeah. So yes, they very much can pass with a strong presentation. And then Mohammed was asking whether it's realistic to cover all the KSPs, and the answer to that is very simple. Yes, it is. I've seen it being done very well many times. And I think this comes back, and we'll cover it again, with making sure that that purpose is understood and the story is told, which I think is our next slide, isn't it? So yeah, I think if a learner was coming in to look at a presentation and I've got 14, 15 outcomes and I'll start with one and then I'll move to the other, then they're going to struggle. If they're setting the purpose and they're building the story around that, then yes, they will.
Yeah. Actually, just on that point, Rachel, I think we've been very clear that you have particular outcomes that are assessed in a particular method. And we've made that point a couple of times, but we should also point out that within the method, the assessor absolutely will assess holistically. So if, for example, the apprentice hasn't kind of explicitly talked about the behaviours that are mapped to that method, but it's evident from what they've talked about and what they've presented that they demonstrated those behaviours, the assessor will give them the marks for that. So it's not always as granular as they need kind of X number of bullet points for each of the points. So actually cross-referencing when you're doing that mapping exercise and thinking, okay, I've got one slide here, but in that one slide, I think I've covered off 4 different learning outcomes. It's absolutely fine to do that. And quite often there are outcomes that are very, very closely aligned in behaviours. Usually you don't need some kind of discrete separate piece of evidence for a behaviour. They usually are covered holistically through the rest of the activity.
I mean, Holly, you're just asking whether we stick to the time. It varies by plan. So if, for example, the team leader is a great example, so they've got 50 minutes in total. If their presentation finishes after 20 minutes, then we use the balance of that time for questions. I had a gentleman that did his presentation in 12 minutes, which left me with 38 minutes for questions. The plan did not allow me to ask enough questions to fill those gaps. That is not the purpose of that question. So whilst I had the time, I did not have the amount of opportunity to fill as many gaps as he left with the questions. So I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, this is such a good point. I think it's hugely in the apprentice's interest to cover it in the presentation, because they've got time to develop that presentation. They can get support in developing the presentation, and it's quite iterative in terms of the development process. So they've got multiple bites of the cherry in effect to sort of say, right, I'm going to check this. Do I think I've covered it? If you're relying on the question and answer session, you're relying on how well they perform on the day, which is a lot more difficult.
And Michael, yeah, I hear what you're saying there about some learners who, don't necessarily use the IT. And I would say as assessors, we're very encouraging where people are genuinely nervous about their IT as they're coming through, and we aren't there to sort of give them those basic training. It does have a requirement they're coming in knowing how to get going really with their presentation. I have helped countless numbers of learners get going with sharing screens. I'm very calm about it. I'm very patient. It's more that it sets them off onto the wrong foot rather than necessarily something that we're trying to trick them with.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think as well, it's worth saying I've seen a number of recordings of presentations and indeed interviews and professional discussions where you can see that the apprentice is nervous at the beginning. And actually, some of them have gone on to get distinctions in that method. It's not a barrier towards them doing well. And quite often as well, actually, they might be very nervous at the start. By the time it gets to the end, they're much more relaxed, more conversational. And I think that is largely down to the assessors as well, and just creating that environment where, you're making it clear that you are there to independently assess, but you're not there to catch them out, and you will be patient and supportive. So thank you. Okay, I'll just conscious of time, and so I'll move on to the next slide, Rachel, because I know sometimes people do drop off after an hour, so I just want to get through all the content and then use that last half an hour for those people who can stick around. Okay.
So as Jake's mentioned a couple of times, really, the purpose of the presentation is a useful starting point, and we've picked out 3 very common apprenticeships to talk about this morning, and to really drive home where these things might be different. So for the operations department manager, for example, the purpose is to demonstrate that the learner can apply the knowledge and skills of the project management discipline to initiate, lead and manage a project. and to demonstrate that they can communicate effectively with stakeholders, third party, and make appropriate decisions using analysis and problem solving techniques. Very common in my experience that people forget about the initiation stage, or they're not showing how they've made those decisions using effective analysis. In contrast to that, the team leader it's about demonstrating that the learner can manage and lead teams, that they can solve problems, develop a strategy and a culture that aligns with the organisation. Both those two scenarios allow for a story to be told that really bring those two purposes together and bring the learning outcomes to life. The associate project manager, we put that one in because it's slightly different. The learner would pick the 5 areas that they want to demonstrate, and they can be across multiple projects. They want to provide their best evidence around those 5 areas, and it may not be in the same project and therefore may not form a story. It's probably one of the only standards where it's less about that and more about starting with the outcomes. What is it that I have done, which is the best project that I have done that will bring this learning outcome demonstration to life. And my key on that one is if a learner hasn't used a particular area of the project management toolkit, don't use that in the presentation, because they're going to fall apart without that evidence. It isn't knowledge, it is about that skill and application. So we've picked those because, you know, in a way you could look and think they're all quite aligned and similar, but what's expected to be seen in those presentations being a little bit different.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So we've got 5 minutes left. We've got 2 slides left, so I think we have just about timed it right. This is good. 1 second. Okay, so the next part we wanted to talk about was structure and format, and that's because this is a question that we get asked a lot: is there a particular platform that the apprentice has to use? How should they structure it? What sort of presentation style should they use? And so the first kind of thing I would say is check the toolkit, because there might be something that's mandated in the assessment plan. Typically speaking, the assessment plans are pretty flexible, and it does say, you know, they can use whatever technology they want, whatever format they want. But as we say, 99% of apprentices will use PowerPoint. They can include visuals. It's not always kind of clear that that's the case, but actually things like photographs, snippets of product evidence, bring it to life and also help to validate and authenticate the evidence and the testimony of the apprentice. Company branding, I think, is a really interesting one, which actually I hadn't considered. I hadn't seen any evidence of, but I know, Rachel, you suggested adding this one in. So do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, some of these apprenticeships are coming from organisations that have got a very strong brand and they've already got PowerPoint slides formatted. And, you know, when learners bring those in and they're using their work-based projects or work-based experience on those backgrounds, it is really powerful. Now, that said, it's not compulsory. It's not part of the requirement. Slide designs are readily available in PowerPoint, you know, so there's lots to pick from that might bring across an individual perfectly. But I particularly like it when I say a brand. It doesn't change the score as such, but I feel it's sets the individual off on a professional footing as well for themselves.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. The next one on there is learning outcomes. We did talk about that earlier on, and, you know, we wouldn't recommend kind of listing them on the slides as such. Some standards, we would provide a referencing table for the apprentice to use where they map in which learning outcomes they're covering where in the presentation. If it's a standard where that's not a requirement or there isn't a referencing table, by all means, I think the apprentice can list the outcomes in their notes, for example, just so it's really clear to the assessor where the apprentice feels they're meeting those outcomes. But I wouldn't recommend putting them in to the slides, and I wouldn't recommend using them as the starting point, because then that's when you end up with loads of content and it gets a little bit muddy. And finally is a presentation style that's comfortable for the apprentice. So I've made that observation earlier about the apprentice who just read verbatim. It wasn't kind of, you know, like watching Steve Jobs or anything like that, but actually the apprentice passed. They did what they needed to. That was something they were comfortable with. So they shouldn't feel like they need it to be really sleek and really well polished in order to pass, because they really don't. So The last few minutes, I'm just going to summarize then, and then I can see we've still got 171 people on and 27 questions in the chat box, so I'm sure we can fill another half an hour. But in summary, I just wanted to pick out what I think are the 6 key points really from everything that Rachel and I have talked about. So the first one is supporting learners to fully understand the outcomes being assessed. So part 1 of that, I guess, is which outcomes are being assessed within that method, make sure that they're fully covered. But number 2 is looking at the outcomes individually, because they are often quite compound in nature. So if there's an internal and an external customer, the apprentice covered both of those things, and that can easily be picked up in that kind of practice, in that mock environment, so that it's captured and solved really before the apprentice gets into their EPA. In the DSW toolkits, we always include amplification as well. So if the apprentice needs some support in understanding the learning outcome in a bit more detail and what sufficient looks like, that amplification is a good guide as well. The next point on there is the 5-step process. So this isn't mandated. It is something that we've come up with, but in the majority of cases, it does seem like it's the best approach. It's begin with a purpose. So today I'm going to talk to you about X, Y, and Z. It makes it really clear what you're going to talk about. It helps the apprentice to keep on track, and it tells that compelling story to the assessor. If I was involved in this, and it really brings it to life. Start with that kind of purpose, develop the content, fill in the gaps by looking at the individual learning outcomes, and then that cycle of practicing and refining and practicing and refining, within reason, obviously, in limitations of the availability of the apprentice, but you need to practice it a few times before you go in to do the live thing. Have a clear structure which is articulated at the beginning, so an introduction, the content, and a summary. Managing the time effectively, which can only be done by practicing it. Ensure that the apprentice is prepared and in the right mindset. So we've said mindset so many times, but it is absolutely critical. Of mindset, both kind of psychologically feeling confident and well prepared, but then also practically being well prepared as well in terms of attire and having an appropriate environment and turning up on time and those sorts of things. And then the final point, which might sound kind of an odd thing to say, especially for something like a presentation, which not many people are particularly keen on, is enjoy it. And I do think that the fact that the apprentice has to do a presentation, and the fact that it's usually about things like managing projects, it gives them exposure to stuff in the workplace that they would probably not have had exposure to if they weren't doing that apprenticeship. So there's tremendous value in that, but then also in the actual act of preparing for and delivering the presentation. It might seem really daunting and it might push them out of their comfort zone, but actually for most people, that's a really good thing. And it's something everybody should seek to do, so that it's helping them to develop a range of new skills that are all portable skills that they can use in kind of a range of different industries and jobs, and will live with them for the rest of their careers. So really helping to understand the importance, but also the value of their apprenticeship and their assessment activity, and getting them to enjoy the experience. And it's extremely important. So I think we are 2 minutes late, 9 out of 10 for time management. So that was it in summary, really. So like I say, we've got a lot of questions by the looks of it in the chat box. So what
I grouped a couple together, Jake, which I think is probably worth covering.
Sure.
The timings and what we can and can't do as an assessor is defined by standard. From the team leader one, there's a particular question about that. So they get a 50-minute window within the team leader. A presentation, in my experience, to hit those outcomes would generally be a minimum of 20 minutes. We would stop them after 30 minutes, and that is a question that's being put by someone else. What do we do? Do we stop them? We give them 10% largely in most of the standards beyond. So if it's a 20-minute presentation and they haven't finished, we'll add a couple of minutes on and let them finish gracefully. And that's how I explain it. With the team leader, it is a firm stop at that 30 minutes, and then we move into the question and answers. So it is slightly different by standard. Largely, we will add that 10% on and allow them to just finish things off nicely.
Thanks, Rachel. What I've seen as well is the assessors tend to say to the apprentice at the beginning as well, do you want me to give you kind of a heads up at the halfway point or when you're a couple of minutes from the end? And some actually do want that, and others say, no, I just don't want to be disturbed. I've got my watch here. I'm just going to crack on. Brilliant. Thank you. So for anyone, we've still got 148 people on, so I'm guessing people do have more questions. So please just feel free to continue popping them in that chat box and we'll get through as many as we can.
We've answered quite a lot of ways. We've gone along.
Okay, that's nice feedback in there. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I had some questions, Rachel, actually, I think that I wanted to ask you, which we discussed the other day. So these are common questions that I get actually that we haven't covered necessarily in the slides. So one of them is, what do you actually do? What are some of the practical steps that an assessor does to put the apprentice at ease?
Yeah, it's a good question, because most apprentices are nervous when they come on, and I always well, first of all, we have to press record pretty much as soon as they enter the room, and as soon as we get there. So the first thing is to tell them that we're going to do that, and to support them to relax, just by having, so they're going through things slowly, the process for the day, what we're doing with the recording. I always think it's quite calming. And when we get learners that are really, really struggling with the nerves, I just spend a few more minutes just having a bit more general chat, all on recording, unfortunately, but just to help them get into a bit more of a calmer state of mind. Reminding them that they've really worked really hard to get to this point. It's very normal to feel a bit nervous, and it's what we expect. So I don't know whether that, I always think that learners seem to be a little bit more relaxed. There's some more questions coming in, isn't there?
Okay, great.
Did that answer the question?
I think so, yeah, definitely, yeah. So there's one from David. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the new process. Before, the project was invigilated and then the evidence sent to the EPA. Now they have 4 weeks to develop a presentation after Gateway, and it's submitted to the EPA. When invigilated, it was unaided. Now, although they can work as part of a team, there is more opportunity for support. I'm not sure which standard it is, David. Would you mind just popping that in the chat? I'll move on to the next one in the meantime. So for level 5 ops manager, they have to do a 4,000 word write-up first. Do they need PowerPoint as well? Or can they refer to their write-up when presenting? So I think, Rachel, does that apply to the older version of ops manager?
No, that's more than new.
Is it?
Yeah, it's more than new. I think it goes down to, for me, that if they've got 5,000 words, to be able to lift out and summarise and provide the summary of how they have met those learning outcomes from that report is the key to this presentation. In a way, sometimes it's easier to write more words, to pull it out and narrow it down to what's needed as a summary of those outcomes is very useful.
In theory, though, could they do the write-up, submit it, and then rather than present any slides, just talk through the report?
In theory, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to expand my chat box.
That's so much about the BA project. That's that would be one you'd have to answer that one, Jay.
So BA project must start beyond month 9. A few of us feel we're just creating a project for EPA as a learner move excellent project. Will it be relaxed or amended? Yeah, so this is a really common one actually, and I have a great deal of sympathy personally for apprentices, and it's not restricted to BA. It's the same with most standards that have projects in. I know that the view of the Institute for Apprenticeships is very much that they're not keen on program projects being used for EPA. So I think even with business admin, allowing them to do it from month 9, when that standard's reviewed and revised, if anything, if I'm honest, I think what will happen is it'll be a case of it becomes a post-gateway project. Now, personally, and I'm just speaking for myself here, I do take issue with that notion and that idea, because I do see that what you end up with is kind of arbitrary projects that apprentices are being given or asked to come up with that have been designed purely for EPA and therefore aren't necessarily representative of the work that they're doing in the workplace. And this is really common in financial services. We deliver a lot of standards at level 6, level 7. very long programs. Some of them were kind of 3.5 years long. Those apprentices are involved in massive projects that might be kind of global projects, and they're managing a work stream of it, and they last 2 years end to end, and they often can't use those projects. So I think it is a big challenge, but realistically speaking, I don't think that there will be any moves in the future for when standards are revised for apprentices to be allowed to use on-program projects. If anything, it'll go the other way. Yeah, so comment from Claire there that they feel they're doing a project for the sake of EPA. Interestingly, when it comes to projects, I do know there's a couple of the Trailblazer groups that I sit on currently, where there are projects at the minute in the current version of the standard, and then moving away from those. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons that presentations are becoming so popular, because it gives the apprentice the opportunity to demonstrate their competence, but in a way that requires a lot less of their time. It's a lot easier to develop a 20 slides and do a half-an-hour presentation than it is to write up a 13,500 word project. Okay.
Just looking at Claire's comment about the feedback from the employers about ILM level 5 and doing a project for the sake of EPA.
Yeah, so yeah, I think once the assessment methods have been devised by the employer group and then published by the institute, obviously we're kind of beholden to them as an endpoint assessment organisation. What I would recommend, though, is if you do kind of have that sort of feedback, is either you can channel that via EPA, and we can make that representation to the Trailblazer group, or indeed you can contact the Trailblazer groups directly, which you can do via the Institute's website. I know they changed the functionality fairly recently, and it kind of looks as though you can't do that, but actually if you there's a drop-down box, and if you try to contact them as an employer, I believe it'll give you an email address for somebody, so you can send your feedback to that email address, and then what they'll do is they'll compile that, and then when it comes to reviewing the standard, they will take it on board.
Home to everyone, I don't know who it is who's put that about the STAR method recommended for presenting. I mean, I think the STAR method's brilliant across all sorts of things. So the STAR might absolutely be useful to put across some aspects. I wouldn't recommend it if it's about building that story. So it might be the situation and then what was done in that to hit as many of those outcomes as you can. Might pick out then some of the behaviours as well as the application of skill. Absolutely. Is it mandatory? No. You know, whatever way people need to do it, but of course STAR's always very useful at making sure from a learner's perspective that they've focused on everything that they needed to do to deliver the situation.
Thank you, Rachel. I totally agree with that. There's a comment there from Jenny. Is it possible to feed upwards as well about the strain on learners having been required to meet 100% of descriptors? So again, that is something that we have expressed some concern with, and we were part of a working group that was set up by IFA to gather feedback on grade descriptors, and we fed that in as part of that consultation. That I think when we had apprenticeship frameworks, they were fairly malleable actually, because they were based on tech certs and NVQs, and you had different pathways in there that apprentices could select depending on their individual circumstances and their job role. But now, of course, when you have a standard, it's developed by a group of employers, and then it's kind of all or nothing, and that does put a strain, I think, particularly with, say, a team leader, when you have things around managing budgets. So lots and lots of team leaders just simply don't have that responsibility as part of their role. So what it does mean is the employer then has to create those opportunities, but that can, again, it can be fairly arbitrary or unrealistic in some cases for employers. So it is something we do continue to feedback, and I do share that as a bit of a concern. But again, I can't see that is core to apprenticeships policy at the moment, is that 100% requirement to pass. I can't see it going anywhere, to be honest, in the short term.
Aaron's asked the question a few times. Jake, what do we think about putting scripts in the notes section of PowerPoint? I absolutely love it, and you know, I think that it works very well. It's a professional kit that's out there for presenting in their business as usual way of living, and we tell them they can refer to whatever notes they want to. So if that's in the presenter notes and that's what they're then looking at when they're doing their presentation, absolutely. And I think that's what Jake was alluding to earlier on. If someone reads everything for the presentation, you know, it's fine.
Yeah.
They're reading everything and they're hitting those outcomes. We back to them not having those notes and then missing out key points because they're reading off bullets and they haven't got everything down there.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. There's a question there from Nadeem. Do DSW have plans to provide exemplars of EPA presentations or portfolios? So we have looked at this idea of portfolio exemplars lots of times. Personally, I'm not that convinced on portfolio exemplars simply because I think portfolios just vary massively from one learner to the other, depending on their job and their employer and things like that. And what I wouldn't want to do is create something that then is kind of used as a template. But with presentations, I have actually discussed this recently with my team, and we are planning a video that's designed specifically for apprentices, in which, for example, we give them all the kind of key pointers that we've gone through today with the tips and the pitfalls and stuff like that, and then ask them to watch a video. And then as part of that video at the end, they kind of review how well they think that apprentice did against some of those parameters, just to kind of help them kind of see it from the assessor's point of view. So that is something that we've got planned that we will hopefully be launching in the coming weeks. So Nadeem, can you deliver a webinar on professional discussions? Absolutely, yeah. So a few people, I think we got one, but I think we might have done it a couple of years ago, to be honest. So we definitely will pick that up again. I think particularly as in the olden days, shall we say, of early days of apprenticeship standards, you tended to have assessed portfolios that were followed by PDs, whereas now the PDs are based on non-assessed portfolios. So what it means is the professional discussion's a lot more higher stakes, because even if the assessor's seen a great portfolio, if the assessor flunks the PD, they will fail that method. So it is very important, and we definitely can cover that one again. So Claire, Jake, can I ask you if you're on project approvals? Employers find it frustrating that they have to wait for an EPA to approve their workplace projects before they can be started. Again, that's a standard by standard one, because some of the standards that we assess, it categorically says in the assessment plan that it has to be pre-approved. If there are any where it's not mandated in the assessment plan and we've included that process, I'm not sure if there are, then I don't think we would kind of enforce it, to be honest. So Claire, if you want to kind of pick up with us separately on that, do kind of drop me an email. I think my contact details are on the next slide. I'll just check if you haven't already got them. Yeah, well, if you just email the generic inbox thing for my attention, and I'll pick it up. So any questions that anyone's got about standard specific stuff, we can pick those up for you, no problem. But yeah, if it says in the assessment plan and it has to be pre-approved, then we do pre-approve it. To be honest, I think it's 90% of the time we approve the projects. Because it's difficult for the assessor, really, to be honest, to say whether or not a project's valid based on kind of a proposal. The proof is in the pudding, really, as to what the outputs of the project are. But the only reasons they tend to be rejected, the most common one is where it's just a business as usual, and the apprentice is kind of describing a BAU activity and saying, oh, this is my project, whereas it's kind of, the project really needs to be a clearly defined piece of work with a start date and end date, objectives, and some form of kind of stakeholder management, resource management, and those sorts of things. So question from David, you mentioned the weighting is 50% on the EPA presentation. Is this generic over all the new standards? What's the other 50% weighting split? So it depends on the standard. It's funny because I noticed in a lot of the older assessment plans, they tend to include this term weighting, whereas actually they're just not weighted, because it's a case of you have to pass the method, and especially with the new ones, you have to pass all of the outcomes within it. So I don't think the notion of waiting necessarily applies anymore on apprenticeship stands. I'm not sure it ever did.
APM's slightly different to that, Jake.
Ah, is it? Sorry, Rachel.
Yeah, so there's 5 areas in the presentation and then 10 in the professional discussion.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
The time frames for approving project proposals is a week post gateway. That was Stacey that's asked that question.
So Jen asked the question, why did the project proposal come into place? I'm not sure whether, because what confuses things is I've noticed in the newer version of the level 5 ops manager, I think they call it a project proposal, Rachel, don't they, rather than a project, because they don't actually have to complete it end to end. So there are 2 things. One is what's called a project proposal in level 5 ops manager, and that came into play because that's the way that the Trailblazer group designed it. I think, to be honest, they probably designed it because of that idea of, well, how on earth do you just give a whole cohort of apprentices all individual projects to do in such a short scale of time? It's ludicrous, really, for a lot of employers. So by having a project proposal, what you can do is say, well, I've come up with this idea for a project, I've initiated it, but not necessarily completed it. The other instance where we use that term project proposal is on those standards where we have to approve the project before the apprentice starts delivering it. And I'm pretty sure we would only do that if it's mandated in the assessment plan. Some nice comments there. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I really appreciate it. I know everyone's crazy busy, but we had a couple hundred people on, I think, and majority have hung on for the questions as well, which is brilliant. That's excellent. So what we'll do then, we will thank you so much for the kind comments. It's really generous. What we'll do is we'll share the recording of this with everybody, and we'll also share the slides, and there'll be a link to it on our YouTube channel as well, I'm sure. But if you have any questions that pop into your head after today, the contact details are on there. Please do get in touch, and we'll be more than happy to speak to you. Thank you very much, everybody.